When a quiet, trembling boy approached the school janitor late one evening, pleading to stay in the building rather than go home, Mr. Reynolds nearly dismissed it as a child avoiding bedtime. But the fear in the boy's eyes sparked a moment of alarm. Before we get into the story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for protecting the vulnerable, give this video a like and subscribe for more. Charlie was 12, but there were days he looked younger. Thin arms, narrow shoulders, and a face that wore perpetual worry. His footsteps were lighter than most children's, as though he was trying not to attract attention. Since he had started at Ridgewood Middle School a few months earlier, the staff had noticed something off about him. He rarely spoke up in class, kept his gaze on the floor, and flinched whenever anyone reached out too quickly. Mr. Evans, his homeroom teacher, was the first to see the bruises on Charlie's wrists. They looked like shadows on a pale canvas, oddly shaped and spaced in ways that suggested hands could have left them. Despite these observations, Charlie rarely gave direct answers when asked about his home life. Mr. Evans tried cautious questions. "How are things at home, Charlie?" or "Is someone hurting you?" But Charlie always shook his head, muttered a vague "I'm fine," and pulled his sweatshirt sleeves down. Ms. Turner, another teacher who often covered detention duty, mentioned to Mr. Evans that Charlie seemed particularly anxious around loud sounds or sudden movements. She recalled a moment when a student slammed a locker door, and Charlie almost dropped to the ground as if bracing for impact. Mr. Reynolds, the janitor, was known to be friendly in a quiet, unassuming way. Many of the kids confided in him, aware that he was always patient, especially when they stayed late for after-school activities. One fall evening, he was just finishing up cleaning the cafeteria when he found Charlie loitering near the supply closet. The boy startled when Mr. Reynolds called out, "Everything okay, son?" The weary look on Charlie's face spoke volumes even before the boy said a word. "Please," Charlie whispered, glancing down the corridor as if expecting a monster to emerge from the shadows. "Can I stay here tonight? I'll find a corner. I promise not to cause trouble. His voice cracked and he choked on the words. "I don't want to go home." Mr. Reynolds felt a chill. This was no ordinary request. Kids sometimes complained about chores or being grounded, but Charlie's eyes held a terror that suggested something more sinister. Mr. Reynolds tried to coax an explanation out of him, but Charlie's gaze darted away. He eventually mumbled an apology, grabbed his backpack, and hurried off before the janitor could press further. That one interaction was enough to lodge a knot in Mr. Reynolds's stomach. He went straight to Mr. Evans the next morning. Mr. Evans took this new development gravely. He had spent years teaching and had seen children from a spectrum of family situations, some of them heartbreaking. But there was something about Charlie's quiet sorrow that pierced him more than usual. He confided in Ms. Turner, who shared her own suspicions. They decided to keep an eye on Charlie, watch for more signs of possible abuse, and contact a social worker if warranted. Within days, they had more than enough reason to call Ms. Dawson, a social worker known for her empathy and thoroughness. She arrived at the school one afternoon, unannounced, to have a private conversation with Charlie. He sat across from her in a small counseling office adjacent to the main office. The windows were high, letting in only a trickle of mid-afternoon sunlight. Ms. Dawson, dressed in a simple blazer and carrying a thick folder, offered him a gentle smile. "How are you feeling, Charlie?" she asked. He shrugged. "I'm okay." "Your teachers are concerned," Ms. Dawson said softly, leaning forward so that her voice was low enough that no one else could overhear. "They've noticed bruises on your arms and you seem scared. Can you tell me how you got those bruises?" Charlie looked down at his hands. Ms. Dawson could see the faint tremor in his fingers. I just fell," he mumbled. "Did you fall at home or somewhere else?" Ms. Dawson asked, her tone calm but persistent. "Home." His voice trembled. "I tripped." He swallowed, glancing up at her only once. "It was an accident." The social worker studied him for a moment. She had a keen eye for half-truths and omissions, but pushing a frightened child too hard often made them clam up further. So she nodded, jotting down a note. "If something is wrong, you can tell me. I promise no one will be angry with you, and you won't be in trouble." Charlie just stared at the floor and said nothing more. That afternoon, Ms. Dawson approached Mr. Evans and Miss Turner. "He's not ready to open up," she explained. "But my instincts say he's hiding something serious. I'll do a home visit with his foster parents, see if I notice anything unusual. I might get the authorities involved if there's cause." According to school records, Charlie was under the care of Mark and Linda Pearson, who had fostered him for about 6 months. There wasn't much detail about Charlie's prior placements, only that he had lived in 2 other homes before. The Pearsons seemed outwardly cooperative when Ms. Dawson contacted them, inviting her over the following week. It looked routine, almost suspiciously so. In the meantime, Mr. Evans kept an even closer eye on Charlie. He noticed that the boy's posture was always tense, as though he expected to be grabbed at any moment. He rarely ate more than a few bites of lunch. One day, Mr. Evans attempted to engage him by inviting him to the front of the classroom to read a paragraph from the social studies textbook. The moment Charlie stood up, color drained from his face and his legs seemed to quake. He stammered through a couple of lines, then faltered entirely, face burning red as he hurried back to his seat. Mr. Evans saw the silent humiliation in his eyes. After class, he gently asked, "Charlie, would you like me to give you some extra time to practice reading aloud? Or maybe you could stay after school for a bit?" Charlie shook his head, picking at the peeling corner of a desk sticker. He didn't trust his voice, so he simply mumbled, "No thanks, Mr. Evans." Mr. Evans sighed. He felt the old frustration of wanting to help but feeling powerless until the child admitted the truth. He had no illusions. If Charlie was indeed being mistreated, a single slip of the tongue could mean severe repercussions at home. Children often kept secrets out of terror, believing that if they revealed the truth, the punishments would only intensify. During her visit, Ms. Dawson found Mark and Linda Pearson impeccably polite. Their home was tidy, with tasteful decor, family photos on the walls, fresh flowers in a vase on the dining table, and a living room that looked straight out of a home furnishings magazine. Charlie hovered in the background, expressionless. Every time Ms. Dawson tried to engage him, Linda would jump in with a story about how Charlie was a bit shy or closed off, but that they loved him dearly. Mark lingered nearby, arms folded, nodding solemnly whenever Linda spoke. "Isn't that right, Charlie?" Linda asked, giving him a gentle nudge. "We feed you well, don't we? You always have everything you need." Charlie bobbed his head in a show of agreement, gaze never leaving the floor. "Yes," he said quietly. Ms. Dawson, sensing the tension, took note of how Charlie's shoulders twitched at even the lightest of Linda's touches. Mark seemed watchful in a way that felt more protective of an image than of the boy. But without concrete evidence or Charlie's testimony, there was little Ms. Dawson could do. She left feeling unsettled, certain that beneath the Pearsons' hospitable smiles lay something darker. School routine continued. Mr. Reynolds would see Charlie near the end of the day sometimes, still hovering by the lockers as if unwilling to leave. On a few occasions, Mr. Reynolds nudged him. "Everything okay, kiddo? Need me to call someone to pick you up?" Charlie would always offer the faintest of smiles and say, "I'll be fine." Then he'd shuffle off, disappearing into a sea of students leaving for the buses or the pickup line. It was Olivia who first started to break through Charlie's shell. Olivia was a bright, gentle student in Charlie's class, a girl who never made fun of anyone and always carried extra pencils in her backpack to lend to classmates in need. She noticed how Charlie never seemed to have a pen that worked, or how his notebooks were dog-eared and covered in scribbles that looked more like anxious doodles than actual drawings. "Hey," Olivia said softly one day, sliding into the seat beside him in the cafeteria. "You forgot your lunch in class." She placed a small brown paper bag on the table. Charlie glanced at it, then at her. "I figured you might be hungry," she added. He nodded, quietly thanking her. After a moment of awkward silence, Olivia ventured, "You like drawing, right? I saw some sketches on the back of your notebook page yesterday. They were really good." Charlie's cheeks reddened. He didn't look at her, but he murmured, "They're not that good." "They are," she insisted with a smile. "I can't draw for anything, so I'm super impressed." He allowed a tiny grin to slip across his face. It was the first positive expression she had ever seen from him. Gradually, Olivia found reasons to interact with him each day, sharing class notes, offering a seat at her table, or even just giving him a warm good morning. Over time, Charlie grew less guarded around her, although he never spoke about his home life. Still, that small measure of connection was a ray of light in his otherwise dark daily routine. One drizzly afternoon, Charlie lingered after class, helping Mr. Evans clean the chalkboard. The teacher had begun to notice that the boy took on small tasks unasked, as though seeking ways to delay going home. Mr. Evans hesitated, then said, "Charlie, if there's something on your mind, you can tell me. I know it can feel scary to open up, but I promise I'll listen." Charlie stood there, wet sponge in hand, staring at the ghostly chalk smudges on the board. For a moment, Mr. Evans thought he was about to speak. Then, with a shudder, Charlie murmured, "I'm sorry," and dashed out of the room. Mr. Evans felt his heart clench. That weekend, a teacher workshop took place at the school, and Mr. Evans ran into Mr. Reynolds, who was mopping the hallway. They fell into conversation about Charlie. Mr. Evans revealed how the boy seemed on the verge of confiding something, but pulled back at the last second. Mr. Reynolds admitted that ever since Charlie had asked to sleep at the school, the image of the boy's terrified face stuck in his mind. Monday arrived with a steady rainfall that slicked the pavement outside Ridgewood Middle School. Charlie stepped off the bus, his shoulders hunched beneath a threadbare hoodie. By third period, Miss Turner noticed that he was shivering slightly. She tried to lend him a sweater from the lost and found, but he refused with a frantic shake of the head. "I'm not cold," he claimed. Miss Turner frowned, unconvinced, but she let it go for the moment. Later that same day, Mr. Evans was reviewing homework when he noticed faint bruises on Charlie's neck, partially obscured by the collar of his hoodie. Concern flared within him. He waited until lunch break and asked Charlie to stay behind. "What happened to your neck?" Mr. Evans asked gently. Charlie's eyes grew wide, and he clutched at the collar of his hoodie. "It's nothing," he said. "I'm fine." Mr. Evans struggled to maintain a calm tone. "It doesn't look like nothing. Are you sure there isn't something you want to tell me?" Instead of answering, Charlie bolted for the door, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. He nearly collided with Miss Turner, who was stepping in to ask Mr. Evans a question. Miss Turner and Mr. Evans exchanged troubled glances. "He's terrified," Miss Turner said quietly. Mr. Evans nodded. "I know. And we can't force him to talk." They decided to call Ms. Dawson again, urging her to do a second, more urgent check. The social worker arrived later that week, but again, Charlie gave no clear statement of abuse. Ms. Dawson, while kind, explained she needed some kind of testimony or evidence. She promised she would keep the file open and push for more thorough investigations, but warned Mr. Evans that without Charlie's cooperation, the situation could remain stalled. A few days later, events escalated. Charlie came into school with a pronounced limp. Although he tried to hide it, Miss Turner spotted him wincing as he walked to his desk. In the hallway, Mr. Evans gently pulled him aside, noticing fresh bruises near his ankle. The teacher felt a surge of anger and heartbreak. "Charlie," he said in a tense whisper, "this has gone on too long. You don't have to suffer alone." Charlie's eyes brimmed with tears. He looked at Mr. Evans, then at Miss Turner, who stood beside them with equal concern etched on her face. The boy's lower lip trembled. "I can't," he finally whispered, voice barely audible. That afternoon, Charlie stayed after school again, supposedly to help Mr. Evans straighten the desk. Mr. Evans decided to try a more personal approach, meeting Charlie at his eye level and softening his voice. "You know," he began, "I wasn't always a teacher. When I was your age, I went through some difficult times too." He didn't lie or manufacture a sob story, but he shared enough that Charlie's posture relaxed slightly. "Sometimes, the hardest thing is believing there's someone out there who really wants to help." Charlie swallowed hard, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. He looked down at the floor, then forced himself to meet Mr. Evans's gaze. Something in the teacher's expression, earnest, gentle, and truly concerned, made Charlie feel a flicker of courage. "They hurt me," he whispered. He blinked rapidly, as though he couldn't believe he had said the words out loud. Mr. Evans reached out slowly and placed a hand on Charlie's shoulder, careful not to startle him. "Thank you for telling me," he said, voice hushed. "I promise we'll do everything we can to protect you." Charlie's face contorted with fear. "Don't tell them. Please don't tell them I told you." "I have to tell the social worker," Mr. Evans explained gently. "She needs to know so she can keep you safe. But I promise we'll figure this out." Charlie didn't look convinced. He nodded, tears sliding down his cheeks. Then he tore away and ran out of the classroom. Mr. Evans sank into a chair, heart pounding with a mixture of relief and dread. He knew that telling Ms. Dawson was mandatory. He was a teacher, a mandated reporter, but he also knew that the moment the system set its wheels in motion, things would accelerate quickly. True to his word, Mr. Evans contacted Ms. Dawson immediately. Within the next day, a more urgent process began. Child Protective Services filed a motion to remove Charlie from the Pearsons' home, given his disclosure of abuse. It happened so swiftly that Charlie barely had time to gather his belongings. Mark and Linda Pearson erupted in protests, claiming Charlie was lying. They insisted he was a troubled child who made up stories to get attention. But their anger only fueled the suspicion against them. Charlie spent the next few days in a state-run shelter, a place filled with other children who had nowhere else to go. It was small, with bunk beds lined up in shared rooms and a communal dining area. The walls were painted in cheerful colors, presumably to make it feel less institutional, but Charlie still felt uneasy. The staff tried to be kind, but they were overwhelmed and understaffed. He missed Ridgewood Middle, missed the familiar faces, missed feeling like he might actually have a friend in Olivia, or a protector in Mr. Evans. One chilly evening, after dinner at the shelter, Charlie found himself in the corner of the recreation room, hugging his knees and staring blankly at a flickering television. A knot of older kids were playing video games, their laughter echoing off the walls. Another boy approached Charlie, tried to make conversation, but Charlie just shook his head, mumbled, "I'm not feeling well," and retreated to his bunk. Sleep eluded him. He lay there, eyes wide in the darkness, haunted by images of Mark Pearson's fury and Linda's shrill scolding. The idea that they might be arrested or punished should have brought him comfort, but it frightened him as well. He had been in foster placements before, and nothing ever seemed to work out. Adults always ended up hurting him or passing him on to another home. Hope felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. After a few nights in the shelter, Charlie couldn't take it anymore. He packed his meager belongings into a small backpack, a couple of t-shirts, a toothbrush, and a battered sketchpad, and slipped out a side door while a social worker was busy mediating an argument between two other kids. He had no plan, no real sense of direction, just a desire to escape the suffocating tension. The streets were dark, bathed in a cold drizzle that soaked through his thin jacket. He trudged through puddles, shivering, ignoring the cars that hissed by on the wet pavement. For hours, he wandered aimlessly. At some point, he found an old bus stop with a broken bench and a scant awning. Curling up under it, he tried to shelter himself from the rain. Sleep overcame him in fitful bursts, filled with nightmares of fists and belt straps. By dawn, he was damp, exhausted, and starving. Charlie roused himself and ventured to a nearby convenience store, hoping to find warmth or some sign of a friendly face. Instead, he found only the unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights. He lingered near the entrance, trying to look inconspicuous, scanning the few shoppers who drifted in and out. Then, in a surreal turn of luck, a familiar car pulled into the parking lot. Mr. Evans stepped out, obviously on his way to pick up coffee before school. Charlie's throat closed up, and tears burned in his eyes as the teacher's gaze fell on him. "Charlie!" Mr. Evans rushed over, keys clutched in one hand. His eyes darted over the boy's soaked clothes, disheveled hair, and trembling form. "What on earth, are you okay? Where've you been?" Charlie tried to speak but choked on a sob. Overcome, he buried his face in his arms. Mr. Evans guided him into the passenger seat of the car, turned on the heater, and rummaged in the back for an old jacket to drape over his shoulders. He offered Charlie a granola bar and a bottle of water, rubbing the boy's back as he coughed down a mouthful. "We need to get you back to the shelter," Mr. Evans said gently. "They'll be worried sick." Charlie shook his head, panic flaring in his eyes. "I don't want to go back there." Mr. Evans sighed. "It's not perfect, I know. But it's safer than wandering the streets." Despite his reluctance, Charlie realized he had little choice. He was freezing and starving, and he had no other place to go. So he let Mr. Evans drive him to the shelter. Ms. Dawson was promptly notified, and within hours, they convened an emergency meeting. The staff at the shelter were at a loss. They were overburdened, and Charlie had slipped through the cracks. Ms. Dawson expressed her own frustration at the bureaucracy that delayed permanent solutions for children like him. It was during that meeting that Mr. Evans, feeling a surge of protectiveness he hadn't realized he possessed, offered a radical idea. "Let me foster him," he said. "I have a spare room, and I'm a teacher, so I can keep a close eye on him. He clearly doesn't feel safe in the shelter." Ms. Dawson blinked. "That's quite generous, Mr. Evans. But you're aware there's a process? Background checks, home visits. It won't happen overnight." "I know," he replied. "But can we start? Charlie can't stay in limbo forever." Charlie, seated in a stiff-backed chair, stared at Mr. Evans in astonishment. No one had ever volunteered to take him in so willingly. Part of him feared it was a trick, or that Mr. Evans would regret it the moment Charlie did something wrong. Still, a flicker of hope ignited in his chest. It took some negotiation, emergency approvals, and a barrage of paperwork, but eventually, Charlie was placed in Mr. Evans's temporary care while the official fostering process proceeded. Within days, Charlie found himself in a modest yet cozy house. The living room was cluttered with shelves of books, mystery novels, history texts, old teaching manuals, and the faint smell of coffee hung in the air. Mr. Evans showed him to the guest room, which contained a twin bed, a small desk, and a lamp. "I got you these," Mr. Evans said, placing a set of colored pencils and a new sketchbook on the desk. "Thought you might like to draw when you're feeling bored or anxious." Charlie stared at the items, mouth slightly agape. No adult had ever given him something so thoughtful. He managed a quiet, "Thank you." "Make yourself at home," Mr. Evans said, stepping out to give him space. "Dinner's at 6, if that's okay with you." For the first few days, Charlie's anxiety remained. He slept fitfully, worried that Mark and Linda Pearson might come looking for him. Mr. Evans, sensing the boy's tension, tried to establish routines. Breakfast at a set time, quiet reading after dinner, a short walk in the neighborhood on weekends. He wanted Charlie to feel stability, a sense of normal life. At school, Charlie resumed classes, but now he felt a swirl of conflicting emotions whenever he looked at Mr. Evans, who was both his teacher and temporary guardian. Olivia, hearing that Charlie was back, found him in the hallway and practically tackled him with a hug. He stiffened at first, then relaxed into her friendly embrace. "Don't ever scare me like that again," she said, tears in her eyes. "I thought something terrible happened to you." Charlie's face reddened. He wasn't used to such concern, but he nodded. I'm okay now," he said, though he didn't entirely believe it himself. Legal proceedings against the Pearsons began, but Mark and Linda were cunning. They hired a lawyer who painted Charlie as a troubled child prone to fabrications. The case seemed to sway in their favor initially, especially because Charlie had run away from the shelter, which the defense twisted as evidence that he was unmanageable. Ms. Dawson, Ms. Turner, and Mr. Evans provided statements detailing the bruises, the fear they had witnessed, and the fact that Charlie confessed abuse to Mr. Evans. Yet, the defense countered with claims that the bruises could have come from sports or fighting with other kids. The tension weighed heavily on Charlie's mind. He frequently woke at night with nightmares, drenched in sweat. Mr. Evans found him one morning sitting at the kitchen table long before sunrise, staring into a cup of cold tea. "What's wrong?" he asked gently, although he could guess the answer. Charlie shrugged, eyes full of unshed tears. "They might win, right? Then I have to go back." Mr. Evans's heart twisted. "We'll do everything we can to stop that," he said. "But you need to speak up in court, Charlie. I know it's scary, but your testimony is our best chance." Charlie looked down at the table. "What if they find out what I say?" His voice shook. "What if they hurt me again?" "They won't get near you," Mr. Evans said firmly. "I promise." Court dates came and went with no definitive judgment, each time delayed by legal maneuvering. Ms. Dawson grew increasingly frustrated, but she kept encouraging Charlie to hold on. Olivia offered her unwavering support. She would walk with Charlie to class, sit with him at lunch, and sometimes gently squeeze his hand under the table in a show of solidarity. Miss Turner would smile kindly whenever she passed him in the halls, letting him know she was rooting for him. Even Mr. Reynolds, the janitor, occasionally gave Charlie a secret thumbs up, as if to say, "We've got your back." One day, about 3 months into Charlie's stay with Mr. Evans, the court hearing took a turn. The Pearsons managed to present letters from neighbors and acquaintances who claimed they were wonderful, caring foster parents. It looked bleak. Ms. Dawson warned that without direct, detailed testimony from Charlie, the judge might rule in the Pearsons' favor. She sat down with him in a small conference room at the courthouse, holding a stack of papers in her lap. "Charlie," she said gently, "if you don't tell the judge exactly what happened, they might send you back. Do you understand?" He nodded, trembling. "Yeah. Are you ready to do that?" Ms. Dawson asked. Charlie's voice trembled. I think so." Fear knotted in his stomach, but he recalled the nights he spent cowering in his room, flinching every time he heard the Pearsons' footsteps. He remembered the bruises on his arms, and the times Linda grabbed him by the hair to yank him forward if he didn't move fast enough. He recalled Mark's fury, the raised fists, the belt. Those memories ignited a spark of determination. "I can do it," he whispered, though his eyes glistened with tears. When the day of the pivotal hearing arrived, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Journalists weren't there because it wasn't a sensational story for the media. It was just another child welfare case among many. But to Charlie, it might as well have been the most important trial in the world. He sat at the table alongside Ms. Dawson and a child advocate assigned to help him navigate the legal system. The Pearsons sat on the other side of the aisle, Linda dabbing her eyes dramatically with a tissue, Mark wearing a grim expression. Testimonies began. Ms. Turner spoke about noticing Charlie's bruises and fearfulness. Mr. Reynolds described how Charlie had begged to stay overnight at the school. Mr. Evans recounted Charlie's confession. Then the defense took its turn, painting each piece of evidence as circumstantial or overblown. They implied that Miss Turner and Mr. Evans had a vendetta or were misguided in their concern. Linda, weeping into a handkerchief, insisted that Charlie was clumsy, prone to falling. Mark glowered, stating he had never laid a hand on Charlie aside from strict but fair discipline. Finally, Charlie was called to the stand. He wore a borrowed button-up shirt that was too large, sleeves covering half his hands. The child advocate stood beside him, offering silent encouragement. Charlie's breath came fast, and his heart pounded in his ears. Ms. Dawson locked eyes with him from across the room, mouthing, "It's okay. The defense attorney was first to question him, speaking in a condescending tone. "Charlie, you've been in foster care for a while now, isn't that right?" "Yes," Charlie answered, voice barely above a whisper. "You've been in multiple homes, correct?" "Yes." His hands gripped the arms of the chair. The attorney's lip curled. "Could it be that you have trouble adjusting to new rules and that you sometimes act out? Perhaps you run away when things don't go your way?" Charlie swallowed, remembering how he had fled the shelter. He looked down and said, "Maybe. Sometimes I get scared. Because you make things up, isn't that right? You tell stories about being hurt when really you've just gotten into normal kid scrapes and bruises." Charlie felt tears threatening. He glanced at Mr. Evans, who offered a subtle nod of reassurance. "No," he said, voice shaking. The attorney pressed. "But you can't prove otherwise, can you? Isn't it true that you never sought help, never called the police, never did anything except run away and tell your teacher vague things?" Charlie froze. He wanted to scream that the attorney was twisting everything. But the memory of Mark and Linda's rage paralyzed him. He closed his eyes, recalling countless nights spent cowering. His chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. Ms. Dawson cleared her throat. "Objection, Your Honor. The question is badgering the witness." The judge narrowed her eyes at the defense attorney. "Sustain the objection. Counselor, keep your questions within reason." When it was Ms. Dawson's turn, she spoke softly. "Charlie, can you tell us, in your own words, what happened in the Pearson home? We need you to be honest so we can help you." Charlie's gaze flickered to the Pearsons. Linda's face was twisted in a look of feigned heartbreak, while Mark stared at Charlie with a cold, warning glare. The memory of fists and screaming threatened to overwhelm him. But something in Charlie refused to stay silent any longer. His voice shook and tears slipped down his cheeks. "They hit me," he said, pointing a trembling finger at Mark and Linda. "They hit me," he said again. The words reverberated in the silent courtroom. For a moment no one spoke. Those 4 words hung in the air, a stark, irrefutable statement of abuse. Charlie's tears spilled over as he continued in a rush, describing being locked in a closet, being grabbed by the arms so hard he bruised, being slapped when he didn't move quickly enough. He talked about how he was forced to lie about the injuries or claim they were from falls. He admitted he was terrified that no one would believe him, that everyone would side with the Pearsons. Linda began shaking her head, muttering, "That's not true. It's all lies." Mark looked pale, his stony composure cracking. The judge called for order, banging her gavel sharply. Charlie's sobs racked his small frame, and the child advocate rubbed his back soothingly. The courtroom remained hushed, stunned by the raw testimony. Ms. Dawson ended her questioning, turning a sympathetic gaze toward Charlie. The defense attorney, now at a loss, attempted a few half-hearted questions, but they fell flat against the child's tearful truth. The tension in the room was palpable. It was as if everyone collectively understood that Charlie's words carried an authenticity that no rehearsed story could match. The judge adjourned for a brief recess, allowing Charlie to be escorted from the stand. Outside, in the hallway, he collapsed into Mr. Evans's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Miss Turner hovered nearby, her own eyes misty. "I'm proud of you," Mr. Evans whispered, cradling Charlie's head. "That took incredible courage." When proceedings resumed, the atmosphere felt different. The Pearsons' lawyer tried to salvage their defense, but the power of Charlie's testimony lingered. Medical documentation of bruises and the teacher's statements added weight to his words. By the end of that session, the judge ordered Charlie to remain under the protection of Child Protective Services, specifically in Mr. Evans's foster care. Mark and Linda Pearson were found guilty of child abuse, though the final sentencing was set for a later date. Charlie's relief was immense, but it came with an undercurrent of fear. "Will they go to jail?" he asked Mr. Evans quietly. "Very possibly," Mr. Evans replied, "but even if they don't, you won't be going back to them." Charlie nodded, tears of relief escaping the corners of his eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, he experienced the faint glow of safety. His reprieve, however, did not last. The Pearsons were temporarily released on bail, pending their final sentencing. For a while, it seemed that they might simply vanish or keep their distance. Charlie began to settle into life with Mr. Evans. He went to school, sometimes even smiled at Olivia's jokes, and occasionally helped Miss Turner arrange books in the classroom. He visited a counselor once a week, slowly unpacking the trauma he had experienced. Sleep came more easily, though nightmares still lurked in the corners of his mind. Then, one afternoon, Mr. Evans came home from a grocery run to find the front door ajar. A surge of alarm coursed through him. He called out, "Charlie?" No answer. The house felt wrong. Chairs were overturned, a lamp knocked to the floor. Panic surged through Mr. Evans as he saw Charlie's backpack lying in the hallway, its contents spilled out. There was no sign of the boy himself. Heart pounding, Mr. Evans dialed the police, breathlessly explaining the situation. Officers arrived quickly, combing through the ransacked house. A neighbor reported seeing a car parked out front, with a man and woman forcibly guiding a child inside. Mr. Evans's stomach turned to ice. He had no doubt who it was. Mark and Linda Pearson. They had come for Charlie, possibly in a desperate bid to keep him from testifying any further or to punish him for breaking their household secret. For 4 long days, there was no sign of Charlie or the Pearsons. The FBI was called in due to the nature of the abduction and the violation of a child protection order. Each day felt like an eternity for Mr. Evans, Ms. Turner, Ms. Dawson, and even Olivia, who asked every day if there was any news. Mr. Evans hardly slept, consumed by guilt and dread. He tried to imagine what Charlie must be going through in those terrifying hours. Then, on the evening of the 4th day, the FBI got a lead. A tip about a couple traveling with a young boy who looked scared and disheveled, spotted at a rundown motel just outside the state line. Agents swarmed the area. A tense standoff ensued when Mark Pearson refused to surrender, threatening violence if anyone approached. Linda shrieked about taking what was theirs. In the chaos, Mark tried to pull out a weapon. The FBI responded swiftly, and a single shot rang out. Mark crumpled to the ground with a wound in his leg. Linda surrendered, sobbing uncontrollably as agents handcuffed her. Charlie was found locked in the motel bathroom, shaking so badly he could scarcely stand. The relief on the FBI agents' faces was clear as they let him out. Mr. Evans, who had driven as soon as he got the call, arrived to find Charlie sitting in the back of an ambulance, blanket draped around his shoulders, paramedics checking his vitals. The moment Charlie saw Mr. Evans, he burst into tears and threw his arms around the teacher's waist, sobbing into his shirt. "It's over," Mr. Evans whispered, though his own tears wet his cheek. "You're safe now." Mark was taken into custody, Linda likewise. This latest crime, kidnapping and violating bail conditions, would ensure they faced significant consequences. Charlie was rushed to a hospital for a full checkup, but aside from bruises and exhaustion, he was physically unharmed. The emotional toll, however, would require far longer to mend. In the weeks that followed, Charlie slowly tried to piece his life back together. He returned to Mr. Evans's home, which had been repaired and resecured with new locks and an alarm system. Nights were still hard. Charlie often woke up screaming, convinced he was back in that grim motel. Mr. Evans would rush into his room, sit with him until the trembling subsided, and remind him that Mark and Linda Pearson were in custody for good. Therapy sessions became more frequent, as Ms. Dawson and Mr. Evans both insisted Charlie receive the help he needed to heal from the abduction on top of the prior abuse. At school, Ms. Turner would check in, giving him small bits of encouragement. Olivia, who had been distraught during his disappearance, managed to coax out a wobbly smile from him on his first day back. "I'm so glad you're safe," she said, voice shaky. "I was scared for you." Charlie's eyes glistened with tears. "Thank you," he whispered, "for caring." Meanwhile, legal proceedings moved toward a permanent resolution. The Pearsons' final sentencing for both child abuse and kidnapping charges approached, and the outcome seemed inevitable. Charlie did not have to testify again, as the evidence, including the abduction, was damning enough on its own. Mr. Evans, harboring a fierce determination to give Charlie a stable future, filed to adopt him. When Ms. Dawson brought the necessary documents to Mr. Evans's house, Charlie hesitated. "Are you sure?" he asked Mr. Evans, voice trembling. What if you change your mind?" "I won't," Mr. Evans said gently. "I want you to have a place where you belong, not just another temporary stop." Tears welled in Charlie's eyes. He nodded, a swirl of emotions in his chest: hope, gratitude, lingering fear. The adoption process was long, involving multiple home visits, psychological evaluations, and layers of legal red tape. Yet Mr. Evans persisted, supported by Ms. Dawson, Ms. Turner, and even some of the neighbors who vouched for his character. One bright spring morning, the day arrived for a final hearing on the adoption. Charlie stood outside the courthouse, shoulders tense despite wearing a clean new shirt and jeans. He looked up at Mr. Evans. "You really want me?" he asked in a small voice. Mr. Evans put a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Yes," he said with absolute conviction. "I do." The hearing was far more straightforward than the abuse trial. The judge, having seen the dramatic events of Charlie's case, looked upon the arrangement favorably, especially given Mr. Evans's track record of care and the improvements Charlie had shown in his custody. After a short deliberation, the judge smiled down at Charlie and Mr. Evans. "I hereby grant the petition for adoption," she declared. "Congratulations!" Charlie's heart pounded. It felt surreal, as though at any moment someone would burst in and snatch him away again. But that didn't happen. Instead, Ms. Dawson beamed from the spectator seats, Ms. Turner wiped away tears, and Mr. Evans wrapped Charlie in a tight embrace. At that instant, all the tension that had coiled in Charlie's chest for so long began to unwind. He had a father now, a real family, not just another temporary arrangement. Over the following weeks, Charlie tried to adjust to calling Mr. Evans by his first name when they were at home, though he still sometimes slipped into calling him Mr. Evans. The house was redecorated in small ways. Pictures of Charlie's drawings now hung in the hallway, and a new desk was set up in his bedroom so he could do homework in comfort. There were rough patches, especially at night or when something triggered a memory of the Pearsons. Sometimes Charlie would get quiet, frightened by the notion that all this happiness could vanish in an instant. But Mr. Evans patiently reassured him, time and again, that he was safe. At school, Ms. Turner noticed Charlie's progress. He participated more in class, raised his hand to answer questions, and no longer looked down at the floor when spoken to. Olivia remained a steadfast friend. One afternoon, they sat on a bench outside the school entrance, waiting for Mr. Evans to finish a staff meeting. Olivia teased him lightly about his math skills, and Charlie teased her back about her drawings. In that moment, Charlie realized he felt something close to normalcy, a sense of belonging that eluded him for most of his life. Eventually, Mark and Linda Pearson were sentenced to a lengthy prison term, both for child abuse and kidnapping. The moment Charlie heard the news, he felt a complicated swirl of relief and sadness. The people who had hurt him so deeply would no longer terrorize him, but part of him still wondered why it had to be that way at all. In therapy, he talked through these mixed feelings, and his counselor guided him gently toward understanding that he did not cause their abuse. It was their actions, their choices, that led them to prison. One evening, Charlie sat in the living room with Mr. Evans. The room glowed softly under a standing lamp, and outside, the sun had just dipped below the horizon. Charlie was reading a book for English class, occasionally glancing over at Mr. Evans, who was grading papers. A comfortable silence stretched between them. Eventually, Charlie set the book aside and asked in a tentative voice, "Can we maybe watch a movie?" Mr. Evans looked up and smiled. "Absolutely. Any requests?" Charlie shrugged, a small grin tugging at his lips. I guess something fun? I never really watched many movies before. Mr. Evans got up and perused a small collection of DVDs. How about a comedy? Charlie agreed, and soon they were sitting on the couch, chuckling at a silly scene. At one point, Mr. Evans noticed Charlie wipe away a tear. "You okay?" he asked softly. Charlie nodded, a little embarrassed. "Yeah," he said, voice thick. "I'm happy." His cheeks flushed as he admitted it. "I'm not really used to that feeling." Mr. Evans put an arm around Charlie's shoulders and pulled him into a gentle side hug. They watched the rest of the movie with shared laughter and a growing sense of peace. Though shadows of the past still lingered, those shadows no longer defined Charlie's life. He finally had a place that felt like home. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.